Hello, good morning, and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. The headlines. Drone strike hits Russia's Belgorod and Bryansk regions. NATO top official Admiral Rob Burr says the body is not making military plans against Beijing. Plus, Turkish Prime Minister says Black Sea grain deal could be extended for 2 months. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Belgorod governor, the name of Vyacheslav Gladkov, says additional drone attacks were conducted over Russia's Belgorod region on the border with Ukraine. He said 2 drones detonated and fell over a residential area in the region, adding that no casualties were reported, but 2 residential buildings and a car were damaged. The governor said another drone was shot down by Russian air defense systems over the region, and response teams are assessing the aftermath on the ground. On the other hand, Bryansk governor Alexander Bokomaz says a drone strike hit Bryansk, another Russian region, on the Ukraine border. He says that there were no casualties and that an administrative building was struck in Stardub, adding that response teams are working on site. Meanwhile, Ukrainian forces are conducting effective counterattacks in the Bakhmut area. That's according to the commander of the Ukrainian Land Forces. Colonel General Alexander Syrskyi said on a Telegram post, which reads, "Thanks to our well-thought-out defense in the Bakhmut sector, we are getting results from the effective actions of our units. In particular, we are conducting effective counterattacks. In some areas of the front, the enemy was unable to withstand the onslaught of Ukrainian defenders and retreated to a distance of up to 2 kilometers. The post continued despite a significant concentration of troops and loud statements by Russian war criminals about their intentions to take Bakhmut by May the 9th. The enemy failed to capture the Ukrainian city. He says our defense forces are holding the front line securely and preventing the enemy from advancing." NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg says the alliance needed to ramp up its weapon production as he opened a meeting of defense chiefs. Since the start of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, NATO has asked its members to raise their ammunition stockpiles, which have been badly depleted, with allies trying to put arms supplies to Kyiv and their own militaries on a sustainable footing. Even before the war, many NATO countries fell short of meeting the alliance's stockpiling targets, as officials considered wars of attrition with large-scale artillery battles a thing of the past.
I also expect that leaders will endorse a new NATO Defence Production Action Plan to ensure that NATO continues to have the capabilities we need. We need that investment and production capacity now and for the longer term. We are moving in the right direction, but not as fast as the dangerous world we live in demands.
Meanwhile, NATO Military Committee Chairman Admiral Rob Burr says NATO doesn't see China as a threat and is not working on military plans against Beijing. Relations between China and NATO's leading member, the United States, sank to a low last year when the then U.S. House Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, visited democratically governed Taiwan, which claims the island as its territory. In response, Beijing severed several formal communication channels with the United States, including one between their militaries. Tension eased in November when U.S. and Chinese leaders Joe Biden and Xi Jinping met at a G20 summit in Indonesia and pledged more frequent dialogue.
NATO sees China not as a threat, but as a challenge. And the difference is when we talk about these military plans is that NATO is not working on military plans against China. We are working on military plans against Russia and the terrorist groups. That's where the plans are focusing on. That is where the force structure requirements are focusing on. And I think that is what we will see now, is that the Russians will have to focus on quantity, larger number of conscripts and mobilized people, not well trained, older material, but large numbers, and not as precise and not as good as the newer ones, and that the Ukrainians focus on quality with Western weapon systems and Western training.
Turkish Foreign Minister Mevlut Cavusoglu says he thought the Ukraine Black Sea grain deal could be extended for at least 2 more months as officials from the parties involved held the first day of talks on an extension in Istanbul. Cavusoglu, speaking to the media on his return from a trip to Moscow, says the grain deal was among the issues he discussed with his Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, and he hopes a positive result could be achieved in Istanbul, where talks were set to continue. The UN and Turkey brokered the Black Sea Export Agreement last July to help tackle a global food crisis that has been worsened by Moscow's war in Ukraine. Officials from Russia, Ukraine, and Turkey and the UN made up a joint coordination center in Istanbul, which implements the deal. Kremlin declined to comment on the progress of talks aimed at extending the Black Sea grain deal, which facilitates the export of grain from Ukrainian ports. Moscow has threatened to quit the agreement on May the 18th, unless what it calls obstacles to its grain and fertilizer exports are lifted. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov told reporters that Russia's position was well known and the work on the deal was underway. The United Nations said inspections resumed on Tuesday of outbound vessels under a deal allowing the safe Black Sea export of Ukrainian grain. Ukrainian mobile anti-drone units based in northern regions received 8 new pickup trucks, which they say will help combat Russian drones. Volunteers collected funds and bought the vehicles, which were then equipped with heavy-duty anti-aircraft machine guns. The vehicles were handed over to the military at a ceremony yesterday. Serhiy Naiv, commander of the Joint Forces of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, says units defending Kyiv and the northeastern Sumy region will receive those trucks. Poland has summoned Russia's ambassador over an incident involving a Russian fighter jet and Polish border guard aircraft over the Black Sea last week. The near-miss incident put NATO's air policing units in a higher state of readiness and worsened already hostile relations between Russia and Poland, which has seen who have been strong supporters of Ukraine as they battled the Russian invasion. The incident on May the 5th occurred when a Polish border guard aircraft on patrol for the European Union's border agency Frontex narrowly avoided a collision with a Russian fighter jet over the Black Sea. The Russian embassy in Warsaw was not immediately available for comment. The military object found in a Polish forest in April was a Russian Ch-55 missile. That's according to the Polish private media outlets RMF-FM and Polsat News, citing unnamed sources. Polish authorities said in April that a military object had been found in a forest close to the village of Zamość near a northern city without going into further details about its origin. The area where the object was found is hundreds of kilometers from Poland's borders with Ukraine, Belarus, and the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad. Poland has been on alert for possible spillover of weaponry from the war in neighboring Ukraine, especially since 2 people were killed near the border last November by what Warsaw concluded was a misfired Ukrainian air defense missile. Now, the boss of Russian mercenary group Wagner, Yevgeny Prigozhin, accused a unit of Russia's 72nd Brigade of abandoning its position in frontline Bakhmut, allowing Ukraine to seize territory. The remarks are the latest in a series of public criticisms from him of Moscow's Ministry of Defense for the faltering invasion of Ukraine, and in particular the failure to capture the city of Bakhmut. But while Prigozhin has frequently poured scorn on the Russian military and its leadership, he has not previously accused Russian units of running from battle and allowing Ukrainian forces to advance south of Bakhmut. Bakhmut is the site of months-long assault by Russian forces, including Wagner mercenaries, that has driven thousands from their homes and left the area devastated. Now we're pleased to speak with Mr. Chidi Iwanu, security expert, joining us from Port Harcourt in Rivers State. Thank you for being with us. I beg your pardon, from Lagos, here in the southwest, a region of the country, Nigeria's commercial capital. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. Sorry, it's a little bit noisy.
Yeah, so we gather. The last time we spoke, or the last time I spoke with you on this show, it wasn't 442 days into the conflict. The number of casualties hadn't been suffered, the damage hadn't been done. Could you begin by giving us an overview of what your impressions are this deep into the conflict and why, or what you think about its abating?
Well, I think the most important thing that we can see from this conflict is that, warfare through the years is exactly, it doesn't change. It consists of, young men going out and killing themselves and dying in large numbers. That's, I think, the basic level my basic takeaway from this conflict. That when we talk about technology, drones, cyber, all of this stuff, it always comes down to a young man with a rifle or back in the day, a sword or a spear going out to kill another young man in order to hold ground. But in the wider context, what we've seen is the Ukrainians holding off what is allegedly the second best army in the world. We can debate whether it's really the second best army in the world, but what we can't debate is that it was a huge, very well-equipped army that should have, on paper, defeated the Ukrainians quite quickly. The difference between the Ukrainians and the Russians can be purely down to two things: their spirit, their belief in their country and the cause they were fighting for, and the support of the Western powers, who gave them the means to resist Russia. We've also seen in this past, 400 plus days, that Russia has struggled very much to adapt to its reality. It's been trapped in a paradigm that it's created of itself. In the first instance, it invaded Ukraine in the belief that the Ukrainians would welcome an invasion, or if those who didn't welcome an invasion would run away. When that didn't happen, they were unable to adapt to that reality and got defeated in front of Kiev. When they finally realized that, they had to pull back from Kiev, they went back to the bottom of Donetsk, at the back of Donbass, and they were able to capture, a significant proportion of Luhansk and Donetsk, during that offensive. But what they couldn't adapt to was how the Ukrainians then, managed to, work their way around the problem by using maneuver warfare deception. Because most of that, they've continued to keep the Russians on the back foot, or rather taking the initiative away from the Russians.
We do apologize for loss of audio with Mr. Chidi Iwanu. We'll try and reestablish contact with him in the course of this program. In the meantime, the special military operation in Ukraine has been on what Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov describes as very difficult, but he says certain goals have been achieved over the past year. Peskov said Russia is acting slowly in Ukraine because it's conducting a special military operation and not a war. He acknowledges Ukraine's stronghold in the eastern city of Bakhmut and said a large amount of troops are concentrated there, which is constantly receiving reinforcements. Peskov says the West has made many mistakes and deceived Russia, which prompted Russia to launch the operation in Ukraine, something he says the West became a participant in. He maintains that the recent drone attacks on the Kremlin was an attempted terrorist attack against Russian President Vladimir Putin. By doing so, he insisted that Ukraine has equated itself with the state sponsors of terrorism. He also says Russia will implement all necessary security measures following the incident. Ukrainian officials and the United States have repeatedly denied been behind a drone attack on the Kremlin, referring to the International Criminal Court warrant issued against President Putin earlier this year. Mr. Peskov said, "It's difficult to imagine that anyone in the world will seriously consider issuing an ICC warrant against President Putin, the leader of a nuclear power." Now, Mr. Chidiwanu, joining us from from Lagos, is back with us. You were saying before we went off that Russia seems to have, if I'm to understand where you were going with it, Russia seems to have underestimated their capabilities in this particular instance, regardless of how militarily strong they are. Can you finish your thoughts?
Yes. So apologies for the disconnection, but yes, I think that's the conclusion. Russia has vastly underestimated the two key elements of this conflict, which is the Ukrainian will to resist, and the Western will to support Ukraine. And their main efforts have been to break that will of the Ukrainians, as I said, through the attacks on their energy infrastructure, and also to break the will of the West through attacks, to try to increase the price of energy. As both those have failed, they've turned to the operational element, which was their winter offensive, the attacks on Volodar and the other areas, and clearing Bakhmut. Both of those elements have failed. Bakhmut, as we speak, is still very narrowly in Ukrainian hands, and the Russians have exhausted a huge amount of resource to take a town that, yes, has some significance, but not as much as they've spent on it. So we can assess that the Russians at this point have lost the initiative. The Ukrainians will most likely take the initiative this month or next with an offensive. And the question is, how much will the Russians be able to resist this? And I think a lot of the questions, a lot of what you mentioned in your build-up about Washington around Bakhmut, the dispute between Wagner and the Russian regular forces, is going to play into that issue.
Speaking of NATO and the comments of the Military Committee Chairman, Admiral Rob Burr, who says that, I want to quote him here, he says that NATO doesn't see China as a threat and is not working for military plans against Beijing. He actually said that he sees China as a challenge. This is irrespective of the fact that China seems to be trying to mediate and seems to be trying to broker peace between the two sides.
Yeah, so, from a NATO perspective, China is not really a threat. There are only two NATO powers, or maybe three if you really want to stretch it, that are you've got France, and France has to feel the United North Atlantic around the European landmass and the North American landmass. That's their focus. So China doesn't present a strategic threat to NATO as an alliance, but to certain NATO members. And because the NATO member that is critical to the alliance, the United States, sees China as a strategic threat, NATO obviously has to have a dog in the fight. But I think the words within the Secretary General are correct. China for NATO is a challenge, it's not a threat. It's a challenge because if the conflict breaks out between the United States and China, that takes away U.S. resource, a U.S. effort, a U.S. strategic bandwidth from NATO or for the European theater. So NATO has to find a way to balance that, to manage that. You can see some of the moves taking place now for NATO to have a foot in the door, and in order to kind of mediate between the parties, with Japan looking towards NATO to have a kind of a liaison with NATO and other powers. The danger is that NATO comes in fully as a supporter of the United States rather than as a mediator, and then just becomes another party to the conflict and just makes things worse, and then drags a bunch of states who have nothing to do with China, like Poland, Estonia, Lithuania, into a potential war with China that nobody really wants.
Exactly, and I certainly will say that they won't have any military plans against China, just as he says. Thank you so much, Mr. Chidiwanu, for speaking with us this morning. After the break, Teams clear explosives from Mykolaiv in Ukraine after Russian retreat. Details in a moment. Please stay with us. Stories for the frontier. Welcome back. Ukraine state emergency services are clearing unexploded weapons from rural areas along last year's front line in Mykolaiv region months after Russia's retreat. A Ukrainian counteroffensive in November 2022 pushed Russian troops out of most of the region and parts of Kherson, a village of Blahodityn, which heavily suffered from the war. It found itself on the front line for several months before Ukraine retook it. The officer named of Vladislav Hirtsai, after successfully blowing up helicopter rocket remnants in a controlled explosion, said such weapons were used to fire on military positions and vehicles. He also added that Russian forces held positions in the field of his unit. The Prime Minister says in late April about 30% of Ukrainian territory had been mined by Russians and that the government was focused on demining agricultural land as quickly as possible. The Kremlin has said that Poland's decision to rename the Russian city of Kaliningrad in its official documents was a hostile act as ties continue to fray over the Ukraine war. Now, Kaliningrad, which sits in an exclusive area enclave that is sandwiched between Lithuania and Poland on the Baltic coast, was known by the German name of Königsberg until after World War II, when it was annexed by the Soviet Union and renamed to honor politician Mikhail Kalinin. Now, the Kremlin spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, says the decision bordered on madness. In his words, he says, "We know that throughout history, Poland has slipped from time to time into this madness of hatred towards Russians." Now, Kaliningrad was cut off from Moscow when Lithuania became independent during the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991. In the city itself, people questioned in the streets were split over the move by Poland. Relations between Poland and Russia have historically often been very strained. Moscow says it liberated Poland when its forces drove out Nazi forces at the end of the war. Most Poles believe the Soviet Union replaced Nazi occupation with another form of repression. And reports indicate the death of 32-year-old journalist Arman Soldin in Ukraine coming as a painful shock to his colleagues at his place of business. AFP says Soldin was killed by Grad rocket fire near Chasiv Yar in eastern Ukraine. The attack happened in the town's outskirts close to Bakhmut, the epicenter of the fighting in eastern Ukraine for several months, according to the AFP. They also say Soldin was with 4 colleagues who were all unhurt. They were with Ukrainian soldiers during the attack. He told the editorial staff that the agency AFP working to repatriate Soldin's remains and are also trying to provide support for his family. Kremlin critic and former mayor of Russia's 4th largest city, Yekaterinburg, Yevgeny Roizman, appeared in court charged with discrediting the Russian army. Roizman, who has been fined 3 times for the same offense, now faces 3 years in prison. The Russian authorities have so far launched over 6,500 cases under the new law, according to Human Rights Monitoring Group, OVD Info, including against people who staged solo anti-war demonstrations, posted their opinions online, or wore anti-war symbols on their clothes. The law was introduced 8 days after Russia sent tens of thousands of its troops into Ukraine in February 2022. The next court hearing for that case against the former mayor is scheduled for May the 18th. The case follows a crackdown on dissenting critics of the Kremlin in Russia. In April, prominent opposition figure Vladimir Kara-Murza was jailed for 25 years for state treason and spreading false information about the army 3 times longer than any sentence previously imposed for speaking out against the conflict. Now, I would like to speak with Dr. Kunle Olaomi, retired Navy Commodore and the HOD, International Relations and Diplomatic Studies, Critic University. Good morning and welcome to the program.
Good morning, and thanks for having me.
I'd like to quickly begin by asking you this question, which I posed to one of our guests the other day because of a military background. In the case where you have to command conscripts or mercenaries due to the politics of the war and the situations in this war, in this case, who will be a better option?
Thank you for the question. I've been listening to the program, and I want to really express that some of this analysis are a bit academic, and the strategy Putin is putting on is not really understood. It's not well understood by a lot of people. The ambition of Putin is greater than what we are saying. His ambition is not just to invade Ukraine. He has a larger objective. And that's why you may see that he's not putting forward his core military experts to prosecute these military operations. If I'm going to use any mercenaries, and I'm Putin, of course, I'm going to use Wagner Group. And the reason is that they are expendable. They're just cannon folders, and he's preserving his core military for a future larger battle that he has prepared for. I observe that a lot of people are underrating Putin because of what is going on in Luhansk, Donbass, and most of the eastern flank. He is making use not just of Wagner Group as mercenaries. He's actually using his prisoners to prosecute this war. And that is because he's anticipating that there's still going to be larger operations in the future. He has so many other states that he has his eyes on. Georgia is there. He has Crimea also to contend with NATO in the future. NATO, they have their eyes on Crimea, and Putin is not being stupid by what he's doing. Most of the weapons he's using as well, they are just inventories that were used during the Second World War, and he needs to get rid of them. So using mercenaries is a strategy for him, using them as cannon fodder, wearing down the Ukrainian forces, and getting ready for a future war with NATO possibly.
An interesting perspective at the beginning of your submission just now, saying that Putin has maybe bigger fish to fry. He has a larger objective. That's echoing the sentiments of the Danish Prime Minister Mark Rutte, who says that there are greater consequences for other countries if Putin is allowed to win this war. But others have said that that's too far-fetched, and he just wants to deal with the Ukrainian situation because of the proximity Ukraine has with Russia and its alliance, his proposed alliance with NATO. So when you say that, do you think Putin wants to annex other regions in other former Soviet republics?
Well, that is correct. You know that his ambition is actually to go back to the time of USSR. And if I'm the commander-in-chief of Russian Federation, I'm going to apply the same strategy. People are just underrating his ways and means. I think what he just wants to do is to punish Ukraine as much as possible now, fight a war for attrition, using prisoners, using Wagner troops, using other mercenary groups, and waiting for NATO to make mistakes. He has more in the offing. He has withdrawn all his combatant ships from the Black Sea, near Crimea, and even near the Ukrainian borders. Why is he doing that? Doing that because he doesn't want to damage his ships now. He's reserving them for the future. So he's still going to, his plan is to annex as much as possible all those former USSR breakaway regions, and he's biding his time. I like his strategy, and I think he's doing very well. He has achieved the first objective. People may not know that. By annexing those breakaway regions in Ukraine, he has ensured that Ukraine cannot join NATO anymore. Because if you are at war perpetually and some of your states has been annexed, so if you attack the eastern regions, the Donbass basically, then you will be attacking the Russian Federation. You're attacking the state of Russia. So he has achieved that, that Ukraine cannot and will not be able to join NATO in the future. Annexation is different from recognition of independence of states. So if you have annexed a place, then it becomes part of you. And if Donbass region is part of Russia today, then they cannot join NATO. So he has achieved that. And I think, I don't want to advise Ukrainians or the European Union or NATO, but I think what you can do to stop Putin from doing this is perhaps to activate the 1952 establishment of the EDC. EDC was established around 1952. It was opposed by France. And if you remember, I think it's I think they call them the Putins organization of countries. Or you have the Italians, you have Germans, and you have the Italy. If those countries, which Ukraine is a signatory, can go into Ukraine, they have rights to be there. The Germans, the Italians, the French, they have right to be there because they would not go there as NATO. But if they allow this cat and mouse to go on, and mistakes are made along the line, Russia has enough to actually prosecute the expansionist policy that he has determined to do. It's going to expand it to smaller regions, and it's very difficult because a nuclear state, it's going to be difficult for them to contain him.
Is that, well, obviously they've denied this, that their intention is not this proposition that you mentioned, but what then, therefore, do you think the role of the countries supporting Ukraine are playing? How much of an impact do you think then they're going to have? We have countries such as Poland who are diametrically opposed to Russia. They're very hard line. They do not want to have anything to do with mediation. They adopted the same posture that Ukraine has adopted. We have countries like Australia, we have Canada, we have the United States, we have countries in the EU who are not in any way trying to be neutral against Russia. So with the support that these countries are giving to Ukraine, do you think, therefore, that they will put a nail in the coffin or a wrench in the works of President Putin?
No, not at all. If you observe the global international security environment now, yeah, you can say Putin is a great power, but I think he's a superpower, and he's very smart. He has started long ago to form BRICS, and if you look at it, the BRICS arrangement is expanding. So he has equal allies that can contain the West. You know, you have countries like China. Whether you like it or not, China is with Russia because they have their eyes on Taiwan. And you have other countries that are great. India is with him, and Brazil, South Africa, and some other countries that are equally powerful, Iran. So I don't really think the allies are particularly having upper hand today. North Korea is also there, and is very rational, very erratic. So I think the NATO countries have a limited objective, and that's to weaken Russia as much as possible. As I said earlier in this program, this conflict we are seeing today is going to be protracted. Mediation is very hard. Negotiation is very hard, except the Ukrainians, are persuaded to let go the about 18% or 20% of their territory that has been taken right now. But where does that leave Crimea? The Western powers are not going to allow Crimea to be in the hands of Russia in the long run. So issue of mediation is very difficult. Issue of allies are almost balanced because China is also a great power in its own right, and so is India, with the great population India has. And they have shown clearly that they are not with the West. So I think Australia and some of those countries that you mentioned that are coming to the basket, even Finland, Sweden, and even Norway, most of the new intakes from the Scandinavian countries that are trying to form alliance with the West are also very strategic. And I think that is a win for NATO if they're able to get Finland and Sweden, Norway to their fold, because they have a very large boundaries with Russia, and putting heavy weaponry in those axes are going to destabilize him. But having said that, China has its own interests in Taiwan, and I think it's going to stick with Russia. So the issue of alliance, I think, is equally balanced.
Therefore, do you think that Brazil's President Lula da Silva's position that the countries should stop, supporters of Ukraine should stop arming Ukraine and sending weapons, and there should be a consensus amongst countries who are neutral to come forward to try and mediate, do you think that this will work?
It's not going to work. The objective is to prolong what is going on in Ukraine and to pin down Russia, to get him busy. Again, as I said, Ukrainians themselves are not going to allow Russia to get away with the Donbas region and even the place that was taken, Crimea, sorry. And I've tried to evaluate the possibility of mediation or maybe trying to negotiate. The window now is very narrow because the United States of America have their own objective there, and I'm not sure the US is going to miss this opportunity to also punish Russia and to keep them busy. It's just going to be a stalemate right now. Remember, this war started about 442 days ago, and it has gone through almost the phases of warfare. The first phase is the intelligence. Now the war is going on, that's the second phase. And now they are occupying places, that's the third phase. So if you are going to talk about pacification, which is the last stage, it's going to be difficult with the United States. It's not because Ukraine may not want peace, but because the United States is seeing this as an opportunity to grind Russia for a long time. So I'm not really very optimistic that we're going to have peace quickly as we are looking. Seen other military operations that have taken place over in Afghanistan and so on. Some of these things takes about 8 years, 5 years, 10 years. So we shouldn't be too optimistic. It's too early in the day to start talking about pacification. I'm not very sure that's going to happen soon.
We certainly hope that the worst case scenario in that regard does not happen. But therefore, is there merit in the argument that the Ukrainians are going down this road, and they will continue to do so until they have everything that they've asked for with pushing the Russians out. Is there merit in that argument that those people who are saying that there's a proxy war and people are using this, so countries, the nations are using this conflict as an opportunity to fight a proxy war with Russia? You think there's merit in that argument?
Oh, absolutely. That's what's going on. And it's very convenient for the United States because they're very far away from the scene of operation. So very convenient for them to keep on throwing as much weapons as possible and giving them loans to prosecute this war forever. It's in the interest of the United States for this war to continue. And when you see this proxy war, I mean, people talk about proxy wars in Yemen, they talk about proxy war in Syria, in some other areas, even in Libya. It's an issue between Russia and the United States and the Western powers. But what we are having in Ukraine is completely different. It's completely different. We are not going to be able to compare what is happening in Ukraine to what is happening in Syria and in other places. This is like a God-sent opportunity for the United States. You saw what happened in Afghanistan recently, where they were displaced out of the place. The undercurrent is that Russia and some other countries were actually helping the Taliban, and they displaced the United States out of that. So they're not going to allow this opportunity to go by. They're going to keep fighting in that place. It's not about Ukraine going on until their demands are made. It's about United States pushing Ukraine to continue fighting. And when you see this kind of fight where, you know, it's proxy indeed, but you see a lot of countries that are lining up, and when you look at proxy war that is actually tainted with asymmetry in the scale that we are seeing, it means one thing, that the West are going to use this opportunity to actually put Putin where he belongs. If this was going to end as you are very anxious, it's not going to end the way a lot of analysts are looking at it. Maybe if somebody take out Putin, but that is Russia basically implodes, apart from taking out Putin. If Russia can implode from within, that's when we're going to see respite. This war is not designed to end soon.
Thank you so much for your perspective on the conflict. The retired Navy Commodore, International Relations and Diplomatic Studies, HOD, Christian University, Dr. Kunle Olawumi. Thank you for coming on the program this morning.
Thank you for having me.
Coming up, tearful farewells as Ukraine war separates couple after 20 years. Details in a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome back to our special coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. And joining us in the studio this morning is our business correspondent, Laddie Williams. Yep. Laddie, United States inflation rate eases by 4.9% in April, less than expectations. How come?
Investors, globally, we've been looking out for that US CPI data for April. And the reason why, investors are looking out for this data is they just want to know what's going to happen next with the US Fed when it comes to rate hikes. We've seen they've been raising rates all through 2022, trying to, tame inflation. And The only data that's important to know if it's working is the inflation data. And we've seen April 4.9%, not far off from the 5%, that was expected, but it's showing that inflation is slowing in the U.S., which is good, for the global economy, because you know how the world relies on the U.S. dollar, for global trade. So all of that inflation you see in the U.S. trickles down, into developing economies like Nigeria, and we're seeing that, the cost of servicing debt and all of that going up at this time. So that's putting a lot of pressure. So whatever happens with the U.S. dollar puts pressure, on developing economies. So now we're seeing this inflation data for April. It's a good sign, showing that cost of living crisis is beginning to slow, in the U.S. Good sign, for all of us. And, the investors are looking out for that, key data, because once they started increasing rates, that impacted risk assets like, stocks, Bitcoin, and all of that. So now it's giving the investors that confidence that maybe this might be a good time to, stay in the market if you're still in the market. So at some point, the expectations the U.S. Fed might pause, with the rate hikes. They did raise rates last time they met, about 25 basis points. So the expectation is with this positive CPI data, hopefully the U.S. Fed might pivot and say, you know what, it's time to slow on the rate hikes or start cutting rates. That would be incredible to see because, we've been used to rate hikes. Yeah. So it'd be quite interesting seeing a rate cut.
Exactly. But how is this impacted by the United States is about $33 trillion in debt.
Yes.
And the debt ceiling.
Yeah, we still have that debt ceiling because at this point, the Congress is still trying to decide if they're going to raise the debt ceiling, at this time, because June...
That's what Biden wants.
Yeah, he wants it. So, and we know the Republicans are like, you know what? No, we don't want that.
And they're running the Senate.
Exactly.
Or they're heading the Senate.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, if, that debt ceiling is raised, it's not like, everything is going to get rosy from there, because at the end of the day, you're just shifting, the deadline. Because at the end of the day, they still have to print money to raise that debt limit. And that still plays into that inflation story. Most analysts believe that, the central bankers are responsible for the inflation that we saw, in 2022, because they said in 2020 with the COVID-19 issue that we had with the pandemic, we saw most of these central bankers were printing money, trying to support economies. And economists did warn that this is going to stoke inflation, and it did happen.
That's what printing money does.
Exactly. Yeah. When you go brew, the printing machine. That's exactly what happened.
Okay, China has dramatically increased the use of the yuan to buy Russian commodities over the past year.
Yeah.
Their support for Russia continues.
Yeah, exactly. So we see, China there trying to get their currency, to dominate, globally. And we've seen most countries try to, reduce reliance on the U.S. dollar for their global trade. We've seen that happen, with Russia, with all the sanctions, for their financial system. So they're having to, move to other currencies now. Even though, we've seen debates out there that at some point the U.S. dollar is going to lose that dominance as a preferred currency, but some say that's going to take at least 20 years if it's going to happen at all. But we're seeing, most of these countries, the BRICS and their blocks, looking at, if I'm trading with another country now and we, have a lot of trades that we do, why do we have to rely on the U.S. dollar? So we're seeing these countries say, well, you know what, let's see how we can, like China and Russia, let's use the yuan and the ruble to make these trades. Since the U.S. dollar, now it's becoming a problem, for most developing countries. They're not getting as much dollars as they need because most of them are not producing, well enough and selling abroad. So there's issues, getting the dollar for their trade. So at the end of the day, we see these countries saying, you know what, let's try and trade more in our own currency and see how we can develop another standard.
As a result of this conflict, sorry to interrupt you, is the yuan getting stronger?
So the yuan is actually getting stronger because we're seeing with Russia, trading Russia there, we're seeing the yuan is taking the position of the US dollar in their forex market there. We're seeing traders trade more in yuan than before. It rose about 23% in 2022 from about 4% in 2021. So we're seeing it's growing. It's, beginning to happen gradually, but, the experts say it's going to take a long time before you see the US dollar losing that dominance.
The reason why they call it the mighty dollar. I'm removing the or. The mighty dollar.
The mighty dollar.
Okay, thank you, Laddie.
No problem.
Now, finally, there were tears as Ukrainian couple Ivan and Zoya said goodbye after making the tough decision to part ways owing to the Russian invasion of their homeland. Disabled and 73-year-old Ivan Sirotyuk was becoming too much for Zoya to care for, so reluctantly they accepted a volunteer's offer to drive him to safety away from the fighting in Ukraine. The couple had been together for about 20 years. The couple bade farewell as it was driving off to an old people's home. The two women will head towards Kiev region where they'll reunite with their relatives. The Donetsk region saw the heaviest fighting since February 2022. And that's it for today's coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Olumide Macaulay. Do join us again tomorrow. Have a great day.